Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a true interdisciplinary pioneer, global thinker, inspiring leader, Dr. Julio Ottino.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here and give this talk under the auspices of Hagler, sort of more interdisciplinary and material science. And the title is From Clocks to Clouds. And then is how scientific breakthroughs reshape reality and our place within it. So I have to explain first what I mean by clocks to clouds. So the phrase clocks to clouds comes from an Austrian philosopher of science, Karl Popper. He described two kinds of problems. Clock problems, they are problems that could be really complicated, but could be solved, like fixing a clock, okay? For example, fusion is a really massive problem, but it's an engineering problem that eventually can be solved. A cloud problem is a problem that is amorphous, shapeless. You cannot put your arms around it. It can change because there is human components to it. For example, trying to solve congestion in Houston, you cannot solve it forever. That's a cloud problem. Cloud problems usually have human components within it. Clock problems are problems that are complicated but are independent of people. So these things map into two things that I describe in this book, The Nexus. And there was one chapter about complex systems. And in there I talk about problems that were complicated and complex. So systems that are complicated are systems that could be massively in size or components, but each component has been designed with one objective. You design a nuclear submarine, every part fulfills a function, okay? If one fails, you better have a backup for that thing. They don't evolve, okay? You don't put together a submarine and somehow it will learn to do different things. Complex problems are problems in which they can be seemingly simple, like a school of fish, but somehow they acquire knowledge on how to do other things, like form a school, like you see there on top, and you can analyze a fish to death and never be able to understand how is that they function together. In the same way that you can study a neuron to death, and you will never figure out how, when they connect and form a brain, they produce consciousness. So that's the difference between complicated and complex. Now, in the talk, I will allude to this, but this is the summary of the talk. I will talk about the world that we inherited, and I will go back to Newton and prior to Newton. It's almost certain that most people don't really appreciate the amazing impact of Newtonian thinking on the world. I will try to tell you it's more massive than anything that you could imagine that AI or anything can do now. Then I will tell you how that paradigm disrupted, okay? How different scientific revolutions emerge. And I will mention things from relativity to quantum mechanics to evolution to DNA-inspired discoveries and more. And then I will, since AI is part of it, I will bring AI into the picture. And then I will tell you how the new thinking that is needed could evolve. So the last part of the talk will be the kind of talk that I could give in my other place of employment now, which is a business school, okay? So the Newtonian world, there was a correlation between cause and effect. It was completely deterministic, okay? Every effect had a clear, identifiable cause. The world now is different. The world now is a world of complex interconnectedness. It's a world that is more, the reality is more probabilistic rather than deterministic, okay? There is a world that is emergence. Emergence is, for example, when something happens, like a school of fish forms out of this no CEO leading the school of fish, emergence, And this requires a different kind of thinking than the thinking that we were used with Newtonian thinking, okay? So we live now in what I would say is more a cloud world rather than a clock world. And what is driving this complexity? You can all kind of determine causes. It's far more connected than it was 200 years ago. Information changes faster. There's emergence of all kinds. There are feedback loops of all kinds. The world now is a cloud world. Now, what's the problem here? The problem arises when you use clock thinking to address cloud problems. And I will give some examples of that. In passing, you can write books about each of them, and some people probably here know some of those in detail. So the problem is our thinking prepared to deal with cloud problems? And my answer to that question is probably no. And why not? Is because of the amazing staying power of Newtonian thinking in the world. And I will try to argue that the impact has been enormous and further more widespread and deeper than anybody can imagine. So I will place in what I'm talking in here, this presentation, is the kind of the outline of a book that I'm writing. So I will be able to convey a few things, but not the depth of research that went into the book. So one thing that I have done is place the Newtonian thing in a big landscape. You cannot read any of those things, okay? But science moves from left to right. I have technology there. I have waves of innovation in technology, and I have even management in there. Why management? Because the world changes when information flows from the science part to the people who can act on the science part. So management will be one thing that I will use as a focus in giving this talk. Now, at some point, going from left to right, algorithms make solutions visible. And at some point, we have the advent of AI. And this is where we are now, okay? But I will start in one location. And since you cannot see this, I will make it bigger. And in there you see Newton's Principia Mathematica, okay? The beginning of a lot on here. But the story that I want to tell started before Newton. And it started with these two guys, Thomas Hobbes and a book that he wrote called The Leviathan. Now, the whole thing starts, and probably at the bottom you can see Galileo and Newton. And this is one of the first connections I want to mention. The year that Galileo died, Newton was born. Newton was really lucky to have Galileo before, because Galileo was the one who battled Aristotelian ideas. Newton had the world prepared for him. So the thing started, the search for laws, the Newtonian ideas about laws governing the universe and everything, it started before Newton. It started like 60 years before Newton. And this is when Thomas Hobbes, a British English philosopher, decided to visit the foremost natural philosopher of his time, that was Galileo Galilei. And he visited Galileo when Galileo, for getting in trouble for the second time with the Catholic Church, he was placed under house arrest, not under very dire conditions. He had a big house, you can see there, he had an observatory, he could continue with research. The problem is he couldn't leave the house. So the thing that fascinated Thomas Hobbes about Galileo was Galileo's law of inertia, which is basically Newton's second law, okay? And Galileo's law of inertia that had to battle Aristotelian views was that if a body is moving at constant speed or is at rest, is because the forces acting on the body are on equilibrium, okay? Before, with Galileo, a force had to be acting on the object for the object to move. Galileo said, no, if the forces are all balanced, the object will continue to move, okay? You know now that the picture gets complicated with friction, but Galileo was able to extract that. So what was the interest of Hobbes on this? He equated from bodies to people. What would happen with people? And he started thinking about natural people, people who are born in those times. We are talking about the 1600s. what forces you have to put on those to create the best society, the best form of government. And he came up with 3 laws, okay? The first one was the Galileo's law of inertia. He came with 2 other laws, and based on those 3 laws, the book has no equations, it's text, okay? He came with the very, very best form of government, who was the Leviathan, who was this powerful king, who would avoid these people just murdering each other and having conflicts, as you see there, okay? A human life that would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And he deduced this, the Leviathan. Now, you will think that kings will be happy that he deduced this. No, they were very unhappy, and that's why Hobbes had to leave several times England and go into Europe, because their power was not derived from reasoning, it was derived from the divine God. That's why you were king, okay? So, but this was the first time that people were searching for laws, okay? And now comes Newton, and these are pages from the Principia. Now, no one can read Newton now. In fact, no one can read a paper from Maxwell now. There is a book that just appeared in Cambridge University Press, All Mechanics, based on Maxwell. I was happy to write a blurb for it, in which they make a point on how to translate the things that Maxwell wrote to modern audiences, because you are not prepared to understand what. So these are pages from Newton. No equations whatsoever, as you know. Calculus came after, although the calculus papers, Newton wrote 1 thing, Leibniz wrote 3. They are really not known to almost, they are not common, okay? Principia was really dissected. Chandrasekhar in Chicago tried to translate it to human ears. But the idea of God as the all-powerful mathematician emerged. And there you have William Blake portraying him as God, looking at the world with a compass. And there is the epitaph that Alexander Pope proposed. He was never in Westminster Abbey, like he said, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light, okay? This was now Newton had a kind of weird component. He believed in alchemy. He believed that studying religious text will discover the beginning of the earth, but he separated all of those things. And by the way, there are many distinguished philosophers, Feynman was one, Sheldon Glashow was another one, who have kind of diminished the mythical status of Newton. They feel like he exaggerated things, represented things with more precision than was needed. So, but the impact was unquestionably amazing, okay? And I'll give you a couple of examples of the unshakable belief by people, the educated people, the people who are looking at science, in Newton's ideas. So for 60 years, it was known that Newtonian mechanics couldn't predict the positions of the moon when it was the farthest or the closest to Earth. That was called the upsides. It was an important problem because for navigation, knowing the positions of the moon, it will guide navigation, but the predictions from Newtonian mechanics were off by a factor of 2. Newton couldn't do it. And then there was this fellow, Clairaut, in France, who proposed, and people were horrified, maybe the 1r squared is not right. Maybe there is a 1r cubed that should be there, and the r cubed is important when the things are close, like the moon and the earth, but when you go to the sun distances, the r cubed disappears. And people like Euler got into the picture. They were really annoyed about this. A fellow named D'Alembert, who wrote the encyclopedia in France, and eventually Clairaut fixed it, and the problem was a problem that the math was not done right. There was problems with higher order terms that became more important, but the lesson in here is when there is a conflict between the physics and the math, bet on the physics. And this lasted for 100 years, okay? And the faith on Newtonian thinking was completely unshakable until there was something that was a problem that I will allude to, but Newton was helped a lot by other people, okay? The people who helped Newton were this philosopher, Voltaire. Voltaire was a philosopher of some renown in France. He got in trouble with the French court, and believe it or not, he was thrown in the Bastille for 1 year in a cell. Believe it or not, he negotiated that instead of being in the Bastille, in prison, could they send him to England? That was a punishment enough for someone in France, okay? So he went to England, he became fascinated with Newton, wrote things about Newton, and he was helped also that his mistress, at that time was this woman, Madame de Châtelet, and Madame de Châtelet was in her own right a really top-notch mathematician. She translated Principia into French, is the translation that is even used today. She even added kinetic energy to Principia that Newton didn't have. And all of those two people tried to diminish Leibniz. Leibniz was the one who had the issue with calculus invention with Newton. And Voltaire even put Leibniz in a disguised form as a protagonist in one of his plays, as someone with simple ideas, okay? So, but then there were people who perfected the Newtonian picture, and among those is Lagrange, the power of rational thinking. He said in the book that he wrote, Analytical Mechanics, you'll find no figures in this book. Equations were enough. And Laplace, who reached the maximum level when Napoleon asked him about mentioning of God. He said, I have no need for that hypothesis. It was all perfect, okay? So the Newtonian picture influenced theology. If everything is deterministic, is there free will? What's the role of God? If everything is put in motion and everything happens deterministically. Affected philosophy with John Locke, David Hume, Kant, Voltaire, several famous philosophers. Economics, the concept of invisible hand, Adam Smith, comes from Newtonian thinking. The separation of powers, the checks and balances, the US Constitution, all the founding fathers were believers in deism, which is a branch of kind of religion that we believe in Newtonianism, okay? The balancing powers, all of that comes from there. And organizations, the concept of modern organizations is completely Newtonian, okay? Hierarchical organizations with chains of commands, predictability, planning things, all of that comes from there. So I will use this a little bit as a kind of test for some ideas. But eventually problems emerge because one out of the major triumph of Newtonian thinking, which was discovering a planet with pencil and paper, okay? Neptune. They discovered Neptune because Uranus was not behaving exactly as predicted by Newtonian mechanics. I'm simplifying the story here, okay? They predicted that the reason for the disturbances was an unknown planet, and two people, John Couch Adams in England and Jean Le Verrier in France, but calculated where this planet could be that was producing these disturbances, okay? And Le Verrier kind of won the race, announced the findings to Berlin, to an observatory, and within an hour, Berlin found Neptune. So the power of humans to predict the functioning of the universe was unshakable, okay? The calculations were enormously complicated, okay? We saw a little bit with the calculating the upsides of the moon, that there was an error. These were as complex as those because no one could solve the three-body problem, okay? Nevertheless, the belief in precision ruled the world. And this fellow, Albert Michelson, who was the first Nobel prize in science in the US. He was a professor in the US Naval Academy and a graduate of the US Naval Academy. He's the one who basically proved that the ether doesn't exist. He conducted experiments about the speed of light. He's quoted as having said that progress, this is, remember the year, this is, I think was 1900, something like that. I don't know if I have the date in there. He said that progress in discoveries in the next century have been to be looked in the 6th place of decimals. Okay, that's the, and he quoted several examples, like that they were a result of precision, and one of the ones that he mentioned explicitly was the discovery of Neptune by Leverrier, okay? And this was in about 1890-something, but 5 years before, Poincaré had discovered that when you study the motion of 3 bodies, 3 planets, that became a huge problem with prizes awarded by the King of Sweden, okay, for the first one who would solve this, and they believed that they could solve it. And Poincaré showed that this couldn't be solved because the problem inherently produced chaos. There is an entire book in there written by John Barrow Green about this problem because it was fascinating, but 3 bodies produce chaos. This was before Poincaré made the announcement. In 1907, he won the Nobel Prize. By then, chaos was there, but no one really noticed it, okay? So the going forward structure of the book is that we have the principle on top, then we have what I call the awe-inspiring revolutions and the lessons from the revolutions. There is one revolution that I will mention in passing. It doesn't get the aura and the prestige that it needs to be, and it's the chemistry revolution. These people had a tougher time than Galileo because no one was dropping balls from inclined planes, but everybody was doing textiles, producing alloys, doing alchemy, and the chemistry revolution had to disprove all of those things. And in fact, the conservation of mass comes from these people, not from physics, really. Okay? But the chapters that I will have in there is thermo and statistical mechanics, relativity, quantum, game theory. Okay? You will see why game theory. It's not a revolution in the sense that battles something that people believe and they prove it wrong, but you will see why it's in there. Evolution, DNA, and everything that has to do with computing and everything that we see now. I'm not the first to look at this. In 1925, a famous philosopher named Whitehead wrote, 1925, I mean, the ink was not dry with quantum. He wrote a book on the science, what's the title? Science and the Modern World, and covered all of those things. Of course, he didn't reach, but he covered evolution as well. John Whitehead, he was in England, but he wrote this while in Harvard. So these are the revolutions. And in each of them, I kind of summarize it in a couple of sentences, okay? Like, for example, the first one, the power of the many, they have different names. The power of the many, the death of the absolute, the dual nature of things, that's quantum, duality, complementarity. So, for example, in statistical mechanics, when I put the power of the many, is that somehow, surprisingly, assessing things for many, many, many bodies becomes easier than assessing that for a few bodies. We saw with 3-body problem, for example. So all of them have this description. You can add more words to this, but the essence is in the titles of these things. Like, for example, game theory, the science of the tragic. Why? Because it shows the limit of complete rationality. When there is complete, so it happens that my co-author for this book comes from that background, political science, game theory. When you push something to an extreme, pure rationality yields results that are bad for everybody, okay? And for all of them, I encapsulated the result in some way. For example, in here, the dawn of the discrete is computation. It shows that all computable processes can be reduced to simple operations of symbols. At the end, is the essence of computations. Formalize the concept of algorithms. So for all of those, we wrote each piece. And so we have all of those in there, and I'll show you what the color means, the color code. It means all of those above game theory, which is not chronologically, because game theory is 1940, all of those were reactions to some Newtonian process that was not really accounted for, like quantum, relativity, statistical mechanics. All the ones below originated outside physics. And game theory is in there because all of them above connect with math. Von Neumann is the one who did this. By the way, von Neumann, one of the degrees was in chemical engineering, okay? And below, they all connect with life and people, okay? And there are lots of names that appear in there. You can see Lord Kelvin, Gibbs, Maxwell, Einstein, Schrödinger, Bohr, and some appear a lot of times, like von Neumann appears a lot of times, okay? Appears in quantum, appears in game theory, he was the one who created that, appears in, he created, the ideas of evolution come from algorithms that he did in the sense of computing systems, almost at the same time as Watson and Crick did the DNA, had the DNA discovery. And in computations, basically the structure of modern computers until now is von Neumann's architecture. And then you have a couple of people, this one, Mary Fairfax Somerville, who wrote probably the last book where you can summarize all science of the time, and is the person responsible for the invention of the word scientist. Why? Because a fellow was reviewing the book and couldn't refer her as a man of science. So he had made a deal with one of his friends, and he had the word scientist in his back pocket, and he used it in the review of the book. A 13-page review, by the way, 13 pages. And Somerville was everywhere. She was very wealthy. She traveled the continent. She was the person who introduced Ada Lovelace. I don't know how many of you recognize, is the first computer programmer in the world, to Charles Babbage, who was the guy who created probably the first sort of computer. She was the one who orchestrated that thing. So, and I mentioned game theory, and I mentioned below game theory was Darwin and evolution, and Darwin corresponded with lots of people. There are 15,000 letters that have been saved of correspondence of Darwin with people, but Darwin never talked with people above, the Einsteins, the Maxwells, Clausius, any of those. But then recently I discovered that Darwin was fascinated, Boltzmann was fascinated by Darwin, even to say that the next century will be named the century of the mechanical view of nature of Darwin, okay? He saw a clear connection between the statistical mechanics that he was doing and the emergence of things with Darwin. And he wrote it in his writings, the ones that I mentioned there at the bottom, the name of Darwin appears 19 times. Now, but he changed the concept of what the law could be, okay? A law, in Newton's view of things, a law was something that would allow predictions. Thermodynamics, Maxwell, a laws tell you what cannot happen, but cannot tell you how to make things happen in a particular way. The same way that the theory of evolution was the first scientific revolution without laws, it's a narrative, okay? But I want to kind of condense the ideas. I mentioned organizations, I put them in there. So if you put all the ideas that come from these scientific revolutions and you want to extract the essence of the ideas and how it would affect the concept of an organization, what is that you will capture? So I had the exercise, I got the little pieces of each of them, and I came up with what you see there, that the organization of the future is one that embraces uncertainty at the micro level, maintaining a strategic direction at the macro level, one that accepts, synthesizes, and draws values on contradictory viewpoints, that comes from quantum, derives benefits from multiple perspectives, relativity, has the ability to evolve ideas, evolution, and creates conditions for emerging creativity and innovation. And you can put more revolutions in there. You can put cybernetics and so on and so forth. And if you want, you can use your favorite AI thing to do this, and you can come up with other descriptions. In here is more biologically oriented. The organization of tomorrow functions as a biological rather than engineering systems, modular, resistant, and interconnected. It harnesses contradictory viewpoints, distributes decision-making, and establishes boundary conditions rather than rigid process. It nurtures informal networks alongside formal structures, and you can see that two things are perfectly aligned with each other. Now, all of these revolutions needed tools. The calculus, and by the way that we teach things, we clean things up. We never teach the battles that emerged in between Newton and Maxwell. Newton was dead, but the idea of Newtonian mechanics had a really hard problem interpreting heat, for example, okay? And also irreversibility, okay? So you have the tools in there, and for example, a tool that gave prominence to all Newtonian thinking was during the war's operations research, which still is, I don't know if you have a department here that teaches industrial engineering, maybe. All of those things are important. And then now you have AI, and what changes are brought by AI, okay? And where does AI belong? Is a tool for Newtonian thinking, could be, or post-Newtonian thinking. My feeling is that AI, for probably most people here, you are not going to outsource your thinking to AI, but if you use AI as your collaborator, it enhances your reach. I gave a talk in the National Academy about this. It can produce cross-domain synergy. And so I will say a few words about AI and creativity, okay? The first one is AI knows everything that is known in the domain up to now, okay? And can answer questions. Can you explain this to me? You'll come with an explanation of that. It can make connections in between two things. Can you connect this and that? And it will tell you. It's good in combinatorial creativity, if you want. Maybe there is a new concept with there. It can connect several things, like, for example, tell me all the patents produced in Texas A&M over the last 50 years. They were by single person, teams, women, men, all of that, you have it, okay? But you have to ask the questions. Can fill holes. Some holes are really hard to fill, okay? There are lots of unproven theorems out there, not theorems, conjectures. Some of them have been pending for the last 100 years. Good luck proving some of those. They cannot. And some of these ideas could be big. I would call them, some of the biggest ones, breakthroughs. A breakthrough is something that grows within the domain, maybe enlarges the domain, and maybe is so new that you can imagine that breaks through the boundaries of the domain, and eventually the domain becomes bigger. That's a breakthrough, okay? But all ideas, what AI uses is everything that was known. All ideas stay within the domain, even the new ones, okay? That's different than creating an idea that is completely outside the domain. That's a break with. And if you start thinking about all the scientific revolutions are break with. They all abandon an assumption that was embedded in the system, and they had to break away with it, okay? Like, things are continuous? No, okay? The viewpoint matters. All of those broke with something. So the analogy that I have for this, there's a book by the fellow named Edwin Abbott about flatland. It's a universe that is in 2 dimensions. They cannot imagine a sphere. When a sphere visits them, they see a point, a circle growing. No amount of 2D can give you a sense of 3D. A system cannot generate its own transcendence, okay? How do you break with assumptions that are embedded in everything that you see in front? An example that I would give is, there are several, okay? You could give every painting, representational painting before 1900, that's how Western art was, to AI prior to 1900 and say what will happen, and you will not come up with cubism. Okay, but in the same way, you could feed every piece of literature prior to 1900, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, whatever you want, you will not come with Virginia Woolf and Proust and Joyce, for example. Okay, so to create a break with, you have to break with the assumption that they were in every piece of training data. Okay, which brings me to this. Picasso said this in 1968, okay, but which computers were ancient, okay, but it's still valid today. And he said, computers are useless, or I think it's stupid, he said, useless. They only answer questions. They only give you answers. And the question is how you ask questions that will break possible assumptions. I'll give you one example, and many people in here probably know this. Origami has been with us for 500 years. It was there. Okay? Tensegrity has been with us for more than 100 years, and in fact, there is this picture there, lower left, an sculpture from Estonia had an entire exhibit that were all tensegrity sculptures. Okay? And we know what happened. Eventually, what will happen is that origami became codified in math. That math gave rise to now what we call origami engineering, okay? And we have applications to space, architecture, robotics, and everything, okay? And the question is this: origami was there, tensegrity was there. What kind of questions could you possibly have asked that have resulted in those answers? The question couldn't have been, oh, tell me how origami connects with mathematics. If you're asking that question, you already kind of know the answer. So the thing that I think has to happen is that in order to AI be sufficiently exploited, there has to be a renaissance in asking questions ability, reframing problems, what I would call an assumption archaeology, identifying buried assumptions and breaking with them. What I would call the very human characteristic of productive confusion becomes irreplaceable. The ability to be puzzled by what everybody else takes for granted, because that's the only way to move to a break with category. Now, let me rescale the Newtonian impact because I'm not talking about abandoning it. I'm talking about augmenting it, okay? So I mentioned before, founding fathers, all Newtonian, organizations, politics, economics, everything influenced by Newtonian thinking. And to a large extent, we're still living with it, okay? Newtonianism gave rise to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution. The idea of progress became clear there, accumulated knowledge. This is when the people who knew things connected with people who knew how to make things. There is something called the Lunar Society, which in Birmingham, an example of this, connecting knowledge and practice. And knowledge and organization became the engines of growth. If you want to see how impactful this is, a colleague of mine, Joel Mokyr, friend of mine who won just the Nobel Prize of Economics, has written extensively about this, the culture of growth. And there you have the GDP per capita in Western Europe. Don't ask me how do you calculate the GDP per capita in the year 1000, okay? But it's in there. And in there I mark the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and see how things went up. This goes up to the year 2000, and here you have it until 2024. I adapted that anything that is happening now will produce an exponential growth double than you have in here, okay? So we talk about how these ideas affected organizations, but every revolution goes too far, okay? Newtonian thinking was amazing, but when you take anything good to the limit, you produce a bad consequence. And I list here several examples. Some of you may know some of these examples in detail. An extreme case of central planning was the Soviet central planning. It was a complete disaster, okay? But you have the initial COVID modeling, the war on cancer, in which there was one clear win, that you are not dealing with a system that learned and adapted in front of you. So why were these bad examples of Newtonian deterministic thinking? They were blind spots, nonlinearity, sensitivity to initial conditions, coevolution, a whole bunch of things, adaptation, treating uncertainty as ignorance rather than data. And how do we get there? Part of what produced this is overconfidence in your theory, or believing that there is only one theory, okay? The Newtonian revolution was amazing, but everything that happens in there, instead of converging in one theory, converging to a number of theories. Relativity augmented Newtonian, quantum invented, and you have to draw a bigger circle to call it physics. But it's not like everything collapsing into one picture. And what happens when you have only one kind of thinking, you have group thinking. Even the International Monetary Fund had a report indicating how all of these bright economies have failed to predict the financial crisis because they all think in exactly the same way. So to understand, to go from clocks to clouds, you need multiplicities of views, okay? Another big issue is the one that I mentioned in there. When AI comes in here, this is the time in which science produces amazing consequences in producing technology. Why produce amazing consequences in technology? Because we could predict things. This fellow, Eugene Wigner, Nobel Prize in Physics, he was fascinated by the amazing ability of math, and he could have said physics, to predict the functioning of the world, okay? And I would say everything that happened was we understood how things work, we could predict how things work. Now, understanding doesn't lead to prediction. You can understand things, but you cannot predict things. For example, if you use the ideas of evolutions to design algorithms, you cannot predict a priori what the best algorithm will be. You just have to let them compete and find out. So, but understanding was at the center of our ability to create things. But now, with AI, we can predict without understanding. You have to figure out things, but the prediction comes without an explanation. So the evolution that we have from clock thinking to cloud thinking is from certainty to probability, from determinism to emergence, okay? From reductionism to holism, from observer independence to context. You have all the things in there, okay? And what is needed now, this is more part of business education in some sense, is a new way of seeing and acting that embraces the complexity of nature or the world rather than fighting with it, okay? A view that teaches us to design for adaptability, resilience, and see uncertainty even as a source of creativity. Now, what do you need? I think that a lot of the tools are in what is known about complex systems, and there is more than these four things that I mentioned: agent-based models, chaos theory, network science. But complexity gives you the language and the models, but not the mindset, okay? And by the mindset, I mean what else? What else is in there? I'm putting when I put in words like embraces, maintains, draws, evolves, creates, those are things that you have to have in your brain ready to deal with a cloud problem, okay? It's a mindset. And it's hard to capture what that mindset how can you create it, need more. And my feeling is that you need something that will be nexus thinking, embracing a broader set of cognitive abilities, or cloud thinking, and just go. And let me just go back in here. And the next revolution, by the way, is not that it needs more science components, in my view, always needed, okay? But the next revolution has to be more cognitive to embrace the ideas. Otherwise, these ideas have been with us for a good number of years, and if you want to teach the ideas, what is contained in this program? How do you teach it? Creating the mindset is not simple, requires imagining how we educate leaders, design organizations. We still reward prediction, optimization, control, the tools of the clockwork age. Yet what the future demands is something different, the ability to work with uncertainty, to design for adaptability, to foster resilience, to see failure as feedback or information rather than defeat, okay? And this goes to the question of leadership, okay? And this is something that I have been thinking about, and we put ideas. I'm not going to go through the ideas, but this, we developed this thing we are going to do with IBM, rules nexus leadership, rules for a world without rules, really. And we did lots of preparations and on how these people have to look and behave and what were the important things that they have to that, and we wrote characteristics like if they are boundary domain fluidity, transdisciplinary synthesis, and we elaborated on all of this. What I'm telling you, this is to say we have been thinking about this, but it's not like there is an MBA program that has embraced all of this and put it in practice. So for 3 centuries, we live in a clock world, world, one built on prediction, precision, and control. It created an amazing wealth, okay? Gave us extraordinary power, but also sometimes to mistake order for understanding, okay? There are lots of examples that you can come up with where things went belly up because we use only this clockwork thinking. So today we inhabit a different kind of world, and science has been teaching us some of these lessons for a long while, as I said. Relativity killed the absolute, quantum mechanics put probability at the center of the world, evolution showed that imperfection can drive progress, the DNA showed that the amazing power of a 4-letter code, and computation revealed the amazing complexity that can emerge from even simple rules. So AI extended story, astonishing in reach, yes, yet bound by its frame. It can remix what is known, maybe can come up with fantastic things, but cannot yet break with the past, okay? That still belongs to human curiosity and those who ask questions that reframe what's possible. That's my plea for a renaissance ability in questions. In a sea of sameness, imagination is more important than ever, okay? So the organization of the future is one that will embrace uncertainty at the micro level. That basically says the overall compass is more important than the details, okay? You have to have a compass that guides you. Maybe part of this compass has to be a moral compass, okay? But a compass, okay? So we must stop thinking only as clockmakers, perfecting mechanisms, optimizing things, and learn how to think like cloud watchers, okay? That is the art and the promise of thinking in a complex world or the cloud, okay? Thank you.